They all screamed as their elderly neighbor reached Lincoln and swung his rake in a blind rage. Lincoln dove out of the way and landed on his right side again. He looked back up and Mr. Grouse came swinging at him again. Lincoln wasn't going to be able to get up and out of the way in time. All he could do was hold Lola tighter to him and brace himself. The infected adult rose the rake and prepared to swing downward. "No!" Clyde shouted as he latched onto the end of the rake and held onto it with all his might. Then Lincoln's sisters did the same. "No, don't!" Lincoln shouted. He didn't want Clyde or his sisters to put themselves in harm's way for his sake. Lincoln quickly got to his feet and gingerly pulled Lola away from his body. He told her to run to their front door as he tried to set her down, but she was reluctant. Lincoln pleaded with Lola to hurry as he tried his best to get her to let go of him. Mr. Grouse began to shake the rake as Clyde and Lincoln's sisters held onto it with all the strength they could muster. Eventually, they couldn't hold on any longer, and the force of the shaking rake sent them flying a few yards away. Lincoln shouted again, and the old man looked back at him with the same rage-filled face that every other grown-up had. Lincoln was terrified, but he had to stand between his neighbor and Lola, who, thanks to her stubborn fear, was still in harm's way. Lincoln wished Lola had run when he told her to, but he understood that she was scared. They all were. Lincoln then grabbed Lola by the hand. "Get ready to run," he told her, "and no matter what, don't stop until you reach the door." She just responded with a gurgled sob and a nod. Lincoln knew that she wouldn't be able to run very well since she was wearing a dress and she was no longer wearing any shoes. Her heels that she usually wore must have fallen off some time ago. Their neighbor charged at Lincoln again. He ran and tugged Lola along, putting himself between her and Mr. Grouse, ducking as he swung his rake at him again. Lincoln then let go of Lola's hand and watched as she continued to run towards the door to their house. She then noticed that Lincoln was no longer beside her. She turned back and cried his name. "Keep going," he told her. He then looked at Clyde and all his other sisters. He told them to run too. Clyde stretched his arms around them and hurried them to the door. Lincoln looked back at his neighbor who was rushing at him again. He couldn't believe how fast Mr. Grouse was moving at his old age. He quickly jumped out of the way as the adult swung his rake again, only this time Lincoln slipped on dog poop as he skidded across the ground. Mr. Grouse came at Lincoln again as he lied on the ground. Lincoln desperately tried to get up, but he was exhausted. He had been more physical in the last hour than he had been all week, and he was always busy. He did have 10 sisters after all. As Lincoln struggled to find the energy to act fast, he wished more than anything that none of this was happening. He thought today was going to be just like any other day. He just wanted to be in his room reading comics in his underwear, and planning what activities he would do tomorrow, and the next day, like video games, going to the arcade, going to the park, watching his favorite shows, playing with his friends, and spending time with his sisters. He never would have thought that he'd meet his demise by his neighbor, Mr. Grouse. The grown-up raised his rake yet again, and shrieked as he prepared to deliver a lethal blow. Then, over the roar of Mr. Grouse, Lincoln heard one of his sisters cry out, and Clyde shout something. Lana suddenly appeared and grunted as she struck Mr. Grouse in the ankle as hard as she could with her wrench, causing a snapping sound. Their neighbor dropped to one knee and planted the handle to the rake against the ground to support his weight. He then swung at Lana and struck her in the face with his hand. "Lana, no!" Lincoln cried. His other sisters quickly rushed to Lincoln and Lana's side. Clyde desperately tried to grab whoever he could to stop them, but they were too quick. They all leapt and piled on Mr. Grouse's back as he dropped to the ground under their weight. Lucy then took out her screwdriver and plunged it right into the back of Mr. Grouse's head, ending the old man's strain of rage. Lincoln just lied there stunned at what he had just witnessed. His sisters stared at Lucy as well, who seemed to be just as taken aback at what she had just done as they were. She then turned at them and noticed the discernment on their faces. "What else was I supposed to do?" she asked. It took a few seconds before anyone said anything. In that time, the only sounds were the sounds of screaming kids and wailing adults coming from the distance. Finally, Lana spoke up. "She's right. We had no choice." She then looked at her wrench she had used earlier. It still had bloodstains on it. "We have to protect each other." Lincoln began to get up as Clyde reached them after standing in silence. "I'm sorry, man," Clyde cried. They were so fast, It's okay, Lincoln told him, before looking back at his sisters. Thanks for the help, he began as he stood up and walked towards his sisters. But I don't want any of you to do something as reckless as that for me, ever again. His voice was stern by the end of his sentence. His sisters all stared at him with worried and slightly puzzled expressions. We were just trying to protect you, said Lana. That's my job, Lincoln responded as he stretched his arms out and hugged all his sisters in a comforting embrace. They all held each other for a few seconds, ignoring the world that was continuing to plunge deeper and deeper into chaos. Come on, Lincoln finally said, his voice bringing them all back to the cold reality. It's not safe out here. He motioned toward the door and waited for them all to get in front of him and Clyde. They all took one more look at their dead neighbor. Lucy debated whether to remove the screwdriver from his head and take it with her, before finally deciding against it. She had plenty of screwdrivers and other tools in her room. Lincoln spoke again once they were all standing on the front porch. I'll go in first. They all nodded. Lincoln looked at Clyde, who nodded as well. I'm right behind you, buddy. And with that, Lincoln slowly turned the doorknob. Lincoln opened the door slowly, which was something he rarely ever did. If this were a normal day, he'd swing the door open, kick off his shoes, and throw his backpack off in a random direction. But this was not a normal day. There probably wouldn't be a normal day for the rest of his or his sisters' lives. The house was dark and quiet. Sunlight streaming through the broken windows, most likely from the blast, was the only thing providing illumination. Outside, they could still hear scenes of chaos and death. The only thing scarier than those sounds were the sounds of silence coming from every room in the house. This was the loud house. It was never quiet. Lincoln walked softly across the living room, wondering where his mom could be. He hoped she'd be waiting for them right by the front door. Maybe she'd left to go find them? No. That means she'd have to take Lily with her, and there was no way she was going to risk putting her in any danger in the outside world. And she couldn't leave her here either. That meant their mom still had to be here. But where? Lincoln looked back at Clyde and his sisters, who had now all entered the house as well. He then looked at the staircase, and then to the door to his parents' room. She's either upstairs in Lily's room, or in her own room, Lincoln thought to himself. He decided to go check his mom's room first since it was closest. He tiptoed over to the door and slowly turned the doorknob. The door creaked open and he steadily peeked inside. He scanned the room from right to left until his parents' bed came into view. There was a lump under the covers the size of his mom. Was she asleep? Lincoln wondered. How could she have slept through the blast and the ensuing pandemonium? Like the sounds of kids screaming and the roar of the plane crash. Maybe she's just tired, Lincoln told himself. She's a busy lady, always working, always cleaning, always raising her kids. She deserves some rest. Plus, living in a house with 11 kids, you learn to sleep through anything. Lincoln continued to open the door. His siblings crept up behind him and peered into the room until they all saw the lump on the bed as well. Mommy! Lola screamed. Lincoln turned to her to shush her, and when he looked back at the bed, the shape had risen to an upright position, the blankets still covering its body. Lincoln's siblings rushed past him, leaving Lincoln and Clyde alone in the doorway. They surrounded the form on the bed, all speaking at once. Finally, Lola hopped on the bed and removed the covers over their mom's head. She screamed. Everyone else in the room screamed as well. Tears began to fill their eyes. Their mom was one of them. She was infected. Mommy! Lola screamed again. The infected adult that used to be their mom hissed and raised an arm towards Lola. The young girl was too scared to move. She just sat on the bed and continued to cry as all her sisters did as well. No! Lincoln screamed. His worst fear had finally been realized. He rushed towards his mom. No, no, no! He continued as he jumped onto the bed and dove right into his mom. He forced her against the mattress. Surprisingly, he was able to hold her down. You can't be gone. You can't leave us. We need you. Lincoln's face was swelled with tears and sweat. As he looked into his mother's eyes, he saw no sense of recognition, no sense of emotion, only the need to cause harm. His mom suddenly found the strength to shove him off of her. She continued to look at him for a moment and then turned back to Lola, apparently deciding that she would be an easier target. Their mom tried to grab her, but instead ended up knocking her off the bed. Her siblings tried their best to break her fall as their mom shuffled to move the covers out of the way so she could get up off the bed. Lincoln got back up and slammed into his mom again, holding her against the bed's headboard. He looked back at his terrified siblings and told them to run, but just as they had before, they refused. Lincoln couldn't hold his mom back any longer and she shoved him again, harder than the last time, which caused him to fall off the bed as well. Their mom finally removed the covers off the rest of her body and stood up. She towered over all of them. Lincoln's sisters continued to wail as their infected mom reached for them. Lincoln stood up again. This time he was angry. He glared at what used to be his mom, so nice and caring, now taken over by a disease. He couldn't believe this was how it ended for her. She worked hard all her life taking care of 11 kids, always trying her best to suit their needs, always trying her best to love all of them, and now she was gone, consumed by the same fate as every other adult in Royal Woods. Why now? He thought to himself. Why did it have to be today? A day when everyone still had their whole lives ahead of them. So much potential, wasted. It couldn't have been several million years in the future, when humans would probably be long gone. Instead, the human race was probably going to end today. This thought made Lincoln even angrier. He laid all that blame on the thing that stood in front of him. The thing that represented everything that had gone wrong today. The thing that was part of the sinister plague that was responsible for so many deaths. He harnessed that rage and projected the fact this thing used to be his mom out of his head. He charged straight for it and slammed into it with such force that the monster's head whiplashed before it started falling. Lincoln continued to push into it as they were both falling. He suddenly felt its body jerk, and then heard something hitting the composite wood of the nightstand next to his mom's bed. Lincoln's sisters all cried out as soon as that sound filled the room. Soon Lincoln and what used to be his mom lay on the floor. Lincoln continued to keep his arms wrapped around her until he realized that she was no longer moving. "Lincoln!" He heard Clyde call out to him. Lincoln lifted his head up and looked at Clyde, and then to his sisters, who just stood frozen with their mouths hanging open. Tears were slowly crawling down their faces. Lincoln's rage suddenly left his body, and he looked at the creature, suddenly remembering that even though it was a crazed adult, it was still his mom. She was still lying frozen on the floor. Then Lincoln noticed a red spot on the corner of her nightstand. "No," Lincoln said, quietly this time. He quickly got up and moved his mom so that she was lying on her back. That's when he finally saw what he was afraid he'd see. A huge gash on the right side of her head. Lincoln threw himself away from his mom's body and landed on his butt. He just sat in stunned silence. What have I done? He turned towards his siblings, who looked as though they were still trying to grasp what had just happened. "You killed her," Lucy finally said. "No," Lincoln thought, searching the deepest reaches of his brain for a response, but he couldn't come up with anything. "Mommy!" Lola cried again, and then all of Lincoln's sisters ran up to their mom's body and began to cry. Lincoln finally got up and walked over to his sisters. He held his arms out, and his sisters welcomed him into the huddle with open arms. They knew he didn't mean to kill their mom, and that he was only trying to protect them. They all held each other and continued to cry over their loss. Clyde stood awkwardly a few feet from them. Tears began streaming down his face too. He had never seen his friend cry like this before, and it broke his heart. As soon as Lincoln began to settle down, he looked at his mom again. He wiped his tear-stained eyes, and that's when he noticed the baby monitor on the nightstand. "Lily!" he said out loud, and somehow his sisters all heard him through their sobs. Worry quickly spread over their faces as it hit them at the same time. Their youngest sister, the baby of the family, the most vulnerable of all the Louds. Lincoln told his sister to wait in the living room and for Clyde to watch them as he raced out of their parents' room and upstairs. Lincoln's sisters followed suit, completely ignoring their brother's orders and Clyde's calling out for them to wait. Lincoln was up the stairs in record time. He burst down the hall and into Lily's room in a single breath. He peered over Lily's crib, and there she lay, sleeping peacefully, clutching her purple blanket and sucking her thumb. Lincoln reached out and touched her. She slowly opened her eyes. "Inkin," she said cheerfully. Lincoln smiled as relief spread over his entire body. He turned behind him and saw his younger sisters and Clyde all standing in the doorway. They all had worried expressions on their faces. "She's okay," Lincoln told them. The worry slowly disappeared from their faces, but they still had the look of dread in their eyes. "She's okay," Lincoln repeated. "It's okay. It's okay. Everything's okay." "Lincoln?" Clyde said. Lincoln suddenly felt a surge of nausea fill his body, and the room began to sway back and forth. He quickly looked around the room and spotted a small plastic trash bin. He hurried over to it and let loose everything he had eaten that day, and then some. The stress of having to protect his sisters, fend off feral adults, and then kill his mom had clearly taken its toll on Lincoln. He'd thrown up before, sometimes because he was sick, and sometimes because he'd eaten too much junk food. But he'd never thrown up out of fear. He dropped to his knees and spit out the last of the foul fluids that remained. He breathed heavily and wiped his nose. As soon as he was done, he looked over at his sisters and Clyde, who just stood and stared with concern. "Lincoln?" Clyde repeated. "I'm okay," Lincoln told him as he got up. "It's just stress." They all nodded, but they were still flustered. Lincoln got up and walked back over to Lily's crib. Lily looked worried too. Lincoln smiled at her, which made the smile reappear on her face. Lincoln looked over at his sisters again. He studied their appearances. Lisa had dirt stains on her clothes and blood stains on her shoes, probably from walking in the blood puddles from her classroom. Lucy had blood stains on her clothes from when she stabbed Mr. Grouse in the back of the head. Lana had blood stains all over her clothes from beating her teacher and Scoots with her wrench, as well as a red bruise on her cheek from when Mr. Grouse struck her. And Lola's face was stained with makeup that had run from her crying, and a wet stain near the bottom of the front of her dress. No doubt Lola was probably more terrified than all of them. Lincoln then studied his own appearance. He had dirt and blood stains all over him too, and a brown spot on a shoe from when he slipped on Charles's poop. He looked back at his sisters and smiled. "Let's get you all cleaned up," he said. Lincoln and his sisters all sat quietly on the living room floor. They were all cleaned up now. The electricity may not have worked, but luckily the water still ran. Lincoln had helped wash his sisters, and now they were all nice, clean, and comfy in different clothes. Lola had to wear a different outfit and shoes that were better suited to run, just in case. After Lincoln was done helping clean up his sisters, and himself, he went down into his mom's room and wrapped her in her bed covers and closed the door. He never wanted to go in there again. Clyde then told Lincoln that he had to go to his parents' house and see if they were alright. Lincoln tried to convince him not to go, but he wouldn't let up. That's when Lisa spoke up and told him she's noticed that everyone who seemed to be affected by this disease were all adults. Clyde broke down, realizing that his dads were most likely dead. It was quite a task to get Clyde to calm down since his inhaler was almost empty. Luckily, Lisa was able to come up with something to substitute it. Lincoln held Clyde as he sobbed over his parents, and Lincoln's sisters also tried their best to comfort him. Then Lincoln and his siblings had to accept the fact that their dad was probably dead as well, which brought a coat of fresh tears upon their faces. After that, they boarded up the windows since there was no glass to keep out the outside world. Not that glass would help anyway. Luckily, Lincoln still had plenty of wood laying around that he'd used to barricade himself in his room whenever April Fool's Day came around. He missed when that was the thing he was frightened of the most, his older sister Luann's pranks. He hoped and prayed that his older sisters were okay. They decided not to board up the doors just in case his older sisters showed up. Instead, they moved the couch in front of the front door and the dining room table against the door in the kitchen. When they moved the couch, they found their dog Charles cowering underneath it. He was just happy to see them as they were to see him. There was also their pet hamster, Geo, who resided safely in his cage along with their pet bird, Walt, who rested comfortably in his cage as well. Lana also had her miscellaneous pets, but most importantly, she had her pet frog, Hops, and her pet lizard, Izzy. As for their pet cat, Cliff, they had no idea where he was. They all hoped he was alive and safe. Somewhere. The house was the only protection they had against the outside world. Sure, there was Lisa's bomb shelter, but unfortunately, a car had crashed and flipped right on top of it, so there was no way they were going to be able to get in there. Instead, all they could do was sit silently on the floor and wait for their older sisters to show up. Hopefully.